When the 18-year-old Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia married Queen Victoria's favorite son in 1879, she was deemed the perfect bride. She was the living symbol of an invincible alliance, a golden thread binding the British crown to the iron heart of the German Empire. For decades, she performed her role flawlessly, a model of quiet, diligent royalty in her adopted homeland. But this diplomatic fairy tale was destined for a nightmarish end. In 1914, as Britain and Germany went to war against each other, that perfect union became a living curse. She was the Kaiser's aunt in a country that viewed him as a monster, and soon the whispers began, she was a traitor. Yet the accusations of 1914, however devastating, were not the beginning of her story. The public saw a cold, reserved German princess, but they had no idea what that coldness was hiding. It was a shield. It was armor she had been forced to build her entire childhood. Long before she was trapped between two warring empires, Louise Margaret had been the silent victim of another war, an emotional war in her own home, a daily struggle between the brutal military world of her father and the fragile artistic world of her mother. This is the story of a woman defined by Pflicht, by duty, and the tragic, all-too-human price of a loyalty that was impossibly and fatally divided. The key to the woman who would be so completely broken by this conflict lies in the world that forged her. This was not the world of her future husband. Prince Arthur's England was a nation of shopkeepers, sailors, and parliamentarians, a vast, sprawling, and somewhat chaotic global empire. Princess Louise Margaret, or Louise Margaret, as she was born on July 25, 1860, was a product of something far more rigid, more concentrated, and more intimidating. She was born into the iron heart of the Kingdom of Prussia. Her home was Potsdam, and Potsdam, even more so than Berlin, was the soul of Prussia. It was not a city of poets and philosophers like Vienna, or a city of glamour and revolution like Paris. Potsdam was a city built by soldiers, for soldiers. It was a garrison town, a place of stone, steel, and unrelenting military discipline. The philosophy of this world, the air Louise Margaret breathed from her first day, was Pflicht, duty. It was a quasi-religious obligation to the state, to the army, and to the king, an obligation that demanded the suppression of personal feelings, of individual desires, and of frivolous comforts. Louise Margaret was born at the very moment this philosophy was reaching its violent climax. The 1860s and 1870s were the years of blood and iron. This was the era of Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who famously declared that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood. While Louise was a toddler, her father and her uncle King Wilhelm I were putting that theory into practice. They waged war on Denmark, on Austria, and in 1870, when Louise was 10, they provoked, outmaneuvered, and utterly annihilated the French Empire of Napoleon III. On January 18, 1871, at the Palace of Versailles, the very heart of their defeated enemy, the victorious German princes proclaimed King Wilhelm I as the first Kaiser, emperor, of a new united German empire. This was the world that formed her. It was a world of absolute, unquestioned victory, of intoxicating nationalism, and of profound, intimidating military pride. And at the very center of that pride was her father, Prince Friedrich Karl of Prussia. To the German people, he was quite simply a legend. He was known to all of Germany as the Red Prince. He was not a gentle, artistic patron. He was a field marshal, a brilliant, ruthless, and deeply formidable commander. He had earned his fame and his nickname from the distinctive bright red hussar uniform. He wore as he personally led his armies to victory after victory. He was a perfect product of his time and place, a man who valued discipline, strength, and duty above all else. He was known for his icy stare, his sharp tongue, and his low tolerance for weakness. To his soldiers, he was a god. To his family, he must have been terrifying. If her father was the symbol of Prussia's military might, her mother was the embodiment of a completely different world. Her mother was Princess Maria Anna of Anhalt-Dessau, and she was everything the Red Prince was not. Where he was steel, she was silk. The House of Anhalt-Dessau was known for its patronage of the arts and musical traditions. Maria Anna was a gifted artist, a talented musician, and a woman of quiet, profound piety. Their marriage, by all accounts, was not a happy one. It was a classic dynastic match that had buckled under the weight of two completely incompatible personalities. The Red Prince, with his boisterous energy, his affairs, and his obsession with the military, had little in common with his quiet, artistic, and deeply sensitive wife. This was the central conflict of Louise Margaret's childhood, a home dominated by the booming martial values of her heroic father and the artistic emotional refuge provided by her unhappy mother. Louise Margaret, the third of four daughters, was her mother's child. She was not like her ferocious father. She was shy, somewhat plain, and possessed a quiet, introspective nature. She inherited none of her father's military bluster, but all of her mother's artistic soul. She loved music, was an excellent pianist, and a gifted amateur artist. She had a sharp, curious intellect, but in the boisterous, masculine, and anti-intellectual court of the Hohenzollerns, these were not qualities valued in a woman. She was seen as delicate. Her health was never robust. She was, in essence, a gentle romantic soul trapped in the most rigid, unromantic kingdom in the world. And of course there were the cousins. And Louise Margaret was the first cousin to a boy who would come to define her tragic future, the young, volatile Prince Wilhelm, the son of the Crown Prince Friedrich, and his English wife, Vicky, Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, the boy who would one day be Kaiser Wilhelm II. Louise Margaret grew up alongside him, witnessing his famously difficult relationship with his English mother, Empress Vicky. Vicky, brilliant, liberal, and profoundly English, had tried to bring her country's values to Prussia and had been met with a wall of suspicion and hostility. She, too, was the foreigner, the English woman, in a court that distrusted her. Louise would have seen the young Wilhelm, with his famously withered left arm, struggling to live up to the impossible, hyper-masculine ideal of a Prussian prince. She would have seen his insecurity, his arrogance, his bombastic posturing, and, most fatefully, his developing deeply confused complex of love and hate for all things British. This was the environment that shaped Louise Margaret. She was caught in the middle of her own family's internal cultural war. By the time she reached her late teens, she was a dutiful, quiet, and perhaps profoundly lonely young woman. Her role in life was clear. She was a chess piece. Her father, the Red Prince, and her uncle, the Kaiser, would use her to seal an alliance. She was a princess of Prussia, and her duty was to marry, and marry well, for the good of the new German Empire. She was 18 years old, intelligent, artistic, and shy. She was waiting for her fate to be decided. What no one, least of all her formidable father, could have predicted was that her escape from this rigid, iron-gray world would come from the one place her family both admired and envied, Great Britain. And the matchmaker who would arrange this escape was the most powerful woman in the world. Across the North Sea, in Windsor Castle, Queen Victoria was looking for a bride. She too saw marriage as the highest form of diplomacy, and she was determined to weave her own children into the fabric of the continent's other great royal houses. Her primary target, her great obsession, was the new powerful German Empire. Her own eldest daughter, Vicky, was already crowned Princess of Prussia. But the Queen had another very special candidate in mind for a German match, her third son, her favorite son, Prince Arthur. Queen Victoria, the grand matchmaker of Europe, had set her sights. Her goal was to find a bride for her third and favorite son, Prince Arthur. This son was her pride, the one who had never given her a day of worry, the soldier who embodied every steady, dependable English virtue. But to understand the brilliance and the ultimate tragedy of the match she was about to make, one must first understand the man she was choosing for. He was not like the Prussian court his future bride came from. In fact, he was its complete opposite. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, was in almost every conceivable way the antithesis of the Prussian court. Born in 1850, he was Queen Victoria's third son, and in a family of complicated, often difficult men, Arthur was the simple, shining star. He was the one who had, from childhood, shown an unwavering sense of duty, a love for the military, and a gentle, uncomplicated temperament. His older brother, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, was a charming, scandal-plagued hedonist, causing his mother endless anxiety. His next brother, Alfred, was moody and difficult. His younger brother, Leopold, was a brilliant, tragic figure, a hemophiliac, living under the constant shadow of death. But Arthur was the good son. He was his mother's darling, the one who never caused her a moment's worry. He was a professional soldier, and he loved it. He was, in short, the perfect, steady, and thoroughly English gentleman. And now, at 28, it was time for him to marry. Queen Victoria, with her dynastic obsessions, was determined to find him a bride. And her gaze, guided by her eldest daughter, Vicky, the crown princess of Prussia, turned to Germany. Vicky was her mother's eyes and ears in the German courts, and the matchmaking began in earnest. The list of eligible Protestant princesses was scrutinized, and one name, despite her formidable father, stood out: Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. On paper, the match was a masterstroke. It would be the second great union between the Queen's family and the absolute inner circle of the new German Empire. It would bind the two houses together inextricably. The political advantages were immense, but Victoria, for all her politics, also wanted her favorite son to be happy. Arthur was dispatched to Berlin to meet the 18-year-old princess to see if the political match could become a personal one. He was 28, a mature man of the world, a decorated soldier. She was 18, a girl raised in a gilded cage of military discipline. This was not a story of passionate love at first sight. It was at first an interview. What Prince Arthur found was not a dazzling, vivacious beauty. He found a young woman who was small, shy, and possessed a quiet, almost sad dignity. He found she was formidably intelligent, spoke several languages fluently, and had a deep, soulful love for music and art. To a man like Arthur, who had no patience for the frivolity of his brother's set, this was profoundly appealing. She was sweet, amiable, and above all, she was sensible, she was safe. And what did she see? This is the psychological key to her entire life. Louise Margaret, the shy girl who had been overshadowed by her father's brutal magnificence, looked at this handsome, kind 28-year-old English prince and saw an escape. He was not her father. He was not the Red Prince. He was not a demanding, intimidating, loud Prussian soldier. He was gentle. He was respectful. His eyes were kind. He was offering her not just a crown, but a lifeline, a way out of the iron-gray world of Potsdam, a way out of the unhappy, silent conflict of her parents' home. She was not just marrying a prince, she was being rescued. And for this, her loyalty to him and to the country he represented would be absolute. The engagement was agreed. It was, by all accounts, a genuine if gentle love match, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. When the news reached Windsor, Queen Victoria was ecstatic. Her journal entry from that day is pure joy. Received the joyful news that darling Arthur is engaged to young Louise Margaret of Prussia. I am so happy. He is my darling, precious, good son. For Victoria, her favorite child was secured, and the political alliance was sealed. In Germany, the Red Prince, for all his anti-English bluster, was also pleased. It was a brilliant match for his daughter, linking his own house directly to the most powerful sovereign in the world. The wedding was set for March 13th, 1879. It was to be a spectacle of Anglo-German unity, a public demonstration of the bridge that Louise Margaret was built to be. St. George's Chapel at Windsor was transformed. This was not just a wedding, it was a summit. The two great rival dynasties of Europe were gathered under one roof. On one side, the British royal family, led by Queen Victoria herself, in her customary black but famously wearing the diamond-encrusted insignia of the Order of the Garter. On the other, the rigid, uniformed might of the Hohenzollerns. Senior members of the Prussian-German court were present to represent the emperor, and walking her down the aisle in a stunning, almost shocking splash of crimson in the ancient English chapel was her father, the Red Prince, in the full, magnificent dress uniform of his hussar regiment. And then there was the bride. Louise Margaret was 18 years old. She was a small, delicate figure, but one drilled in a lifetime of Prussian self-control. She was draped in white silk, her dress adorned with traditional myrtle and orange blossom, and she wore a magnificent veil of priceless Brussels lace, a personal gift from her new mother-in-law, Queen Victoria. She was nervous, yes, but she was composed. This was her Pflicht, her duty, the moment her entire life had been building towards. She walked the length of the chapel, a living treaty, a human sacrifice to the idea of dynastic peace, to marry the kind, handsome stranger who was her salvation. As she stood at the altar, she was no longer just a Prussian princess. In that moment, she became Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Connaught. Her new life began almost immediately, and the culture shock must have been profound. Her new homes were Clarence House in London, a grand, stately townhouse, and their new purpose-built country home, Bagshot Park in Surrey. She had left the iron world of Potsdam for the heart of the British Empire, and that empire's court was a world away from the stiff, moralizing military formality she had always known. The social life of the British aristocracy was not run by Queen Victoria, who lived in secluded widowhood at Windsor. It was run by her brother-in-law, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, and his beautiful wife, Alexandra. This was the Marlborough House set, and it was fast, loud, and racy. It was a world of endless house parties, colossal dinners, gambling, baccarat, practical jokes, and thinly veiled romantic intrigues. Louise Margaret was thrown into this glittering, frivolous pool, and she could not swim. She was, by her very nature, the antithesis of the Marlborough House set. She was shy. She was intellectual. She spoke English perfectly, but with a distinct German accent that she would never lose. She was serious. She wanted to discuss art, music, and literature. They wanted to play cards and flirt. Her new sister-in-law, the dazzling, deaf, and universally adored Princess Alexandra, was the queen of this set. And next to her, Louise seemed heavy, awkward, and German. This was the beginning of her isolation. Her natural reserve, a product of her rigid Prussian upbringing, was immediately misinterpreted by the boisterous English aristocrats as coldness, as arrogance, as a lack of humor. She was not a sport. She was the German bluestocking. She found, however, two powerful and crucial allies. The first was her husband. Prince Arthur, like his mother, had no time for his brother's fast living set. He was a soldier. He liked order, quiet domesticity, and an early night. He and Louise were, in this, perfectly matched. They were a team. They created their own, separate, more sober court, centered on military life, music, and art. They were the sensible couple, and their bond deepened, built on a shared preference for a life of duty and purpose over one of pleasure. Her second and most important ally was Queen Victoria herself. The Queen, who detested Bertie's fast friends, saw in her new daughter-in-law a kindred spirit. Victoria valued seriousness. She admired Louise's intelligence, her artistic talent, and above all, her profound sense of duty. The Queen famously praised the Duchess of Connaught for her absence of silliness, a pointed barb at the other women in her court. Louise became a favored daughter-in-law, a frequent companion to the aging Queen, a woman Victoria knew she could rely on. But the true center of her new life, her absolute sanctuary, became her children. This was the world she could control, the place where she could finally build the warm, loving home she herself had never known. In 1882, she gave birth to her first child, Princess Margaret, who would be known as Daisy. A year later, in 1883, her son and heir, Prince Arthur, was born. And in 1886, her most famous daughter, Princess Patricia, known to the family as Patsy, arrived. Her home at Bagshot Park became her haven. She was a devoted, hands-on mother, a stark contrast to the distant, formal parenting of the Prussian court. She oversaw her children's education, encouraged their artistic talents, and poured all of her suppressed warmth and affection into them. Her life settled into a comfortable, if demanding, routine. She was the model of a soldier's wife. Arthur's career was paramount, and his career meant he was constantly on the move, and for long, long stretches, he was gone. He was a professional soldier in an empire at its peak, and the empire required his service. He was posted to Egypt, where he commanded a brigade during the 1882 Anglo-Egyptian War. And then he was given a major command in India. Louise, as the dutiful wife, was expected to follow him. In 1883, she packed up her young family and moved to the heart of the British Raj. The adjustment was brutal. The suffocating heat, the strange new diseases, the rigid formality of viceregal society. It was in India that her health, never strong, began to show the first serious signs of strain. But she never complained. She opened bazaars, visited hospitals, and played her role perfectly. It was her duty. Through the 1880s and into the 1890s, this was her life, a quiet domestic routine at Bagshot Park, punctuated by the grand ceremonies of the British court and long, difficult postings across the empire. She was a respected, if slightly distant and formal, member of the royal family. She had done everything right. She had escaped Prussia, married her prince, secured the love of the queen, and built a perfect, happy family. She was safe. But back in Germany, the world she had escaped was changing. In 1888, her uncle, the emperor, died. Her cousin, the liberal and pro-British Crown Prince Friedrich, married to her Aunt Vicky, took the throne and died of cancer just 99 days later. And then, a new, far more dangerous figure ascended the imperial throne. Her other cousin, the volatile, arrogant, and deeply insecure boy she had grown up with. Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Wilhelm hated his English mother and harbored a toxic, jealous obsession with Great Britain and its navy. The political bridge that Louise Margaret had been built to be, the bridge that was the entire purpose of her marriage, was already beginning to tremble. The man who was now the leader of her homeland was, in fact, her adopted country's greatest and most dangerous rival. The seeds of her future nightmare were sown. Those seeds of a future nightmare did not sprout immediately. Instead, they lay dormant, a constant low-level poison beneath the surface of an apparently perfect life. As the 19th century entered its final decade, the Connaughts settled into a new phase of their marriage, one defined by this strange new normal, a life of profound domestic peace lived under the constant simmering shadow of a deeply personal and increasingly dangerous political tension. The 1890s settled around the Duke and Duchess of Connaught, a decade of profound domestic peace and simmering political tension. The role of Louise Margaret, now a mature woman in her 30s, became one of extraordinary delicate balance. The bridge she had been built to be was already being strained. Her cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was not a distant figure. He was an unavoidable, bombastic presence in her new family's life. He would arrive in England for Cowes Week, the annual sailing regatta, a chest full of medals, a booming voice, and an almost pathological need to compete with, and best, his British relatives, particularly his Uncle Bertie, the Prince of Wales. And in the middle, tasked with keeping the peace, was Louise. She was the family's built-in diplomat, the high-ranking German relative who could supposedly manage him. Imagine the unbearable tension of those family holidays at Osborne House. Louise, with her quiet, introspective nature, forced to act as a buffer between her swaggering, insecure cousin and her own British family, who were beginning to view him not just as an irritation, but as a genuine menace. She was fluent in both languages, both cultures, and understood the nuances of both courts, and she was perhaps the only one who truly grasped the danger. She had seen from her childhood what Wilhelm was. She had watched him grow up, had seen his jealousy of his English mother, had felt the chip on his shoulder, and now he had the largest army in Europe. This constant grinding stress, the pressure of her very identity, began to take its toll. Her delicate health, so often mentioned by courtiers, was perhaps not just a physical ailment, but the psychosomatic exhaustion of a woman living her entire life on a knife edge. Her life at Bagshot Park was her sanctuary. While her husband, Prince Arthur, was often away, solidifying his role as the Army's most respected senior officer at commands like Aldershot, Louise created a world of art, music, and family. She was a loving, almost doting mother. Her 3 children were her validation. In them, she had succeeded. She had raised them not as stiff, cold Prussians, but as warm, modern, and artistic individuals. Her eldest, Margaret, or Daisy, was emerging as a serious, intelligent young woman, sharing her mother's artistic talents. Arthur, her son, was dutiful, destined to follow his father into the army. And then there was Patricia, Patsy, the youngest. Patsy was the family's star, a vibrant, beautiful, and strong-willed girl who had inherited all the charisma the rest of the family lacked. Louise, the shy princess, had somehow raised one of the most popular young women in England, but this domestic sanctuary was shielded from the outside world by one person, and one person only, Queen Victoria. The old queen was Louise's protector, her sponsor, and her greatest ally. Victoria, who by now was almost entirely secluded, relied on the Connaughts. She adored her darling Arthur, and she respected and trusted Louise. She saw in her German daughter-in-law the seriousness and dedication that she found so lacking in her other children's spouses. For Louise, a visit to Windsor or Osborne was not a chore, it was a reassurance. She was safe, she was valued, she was protected. And then on January 22nd, 1901, that shield vanished forever. The death of Queen Victoria at Osborne House was a global event. It was the end of an era. But for Louise Margaret, it was a personal, structural catastrophe. The woman who had been her mother figure for 22 years, the monarch who had sanctioned her marriage and protected her position, was gone. And in her place, ascending the throne, were the very people who had always defined the world she felt so alien in. Her brother-in-law, Bertie, was now King Edward VII, and his wife, the glittering, beautiful Alexandra, was queen. The Marlborough house set was no longer the rebellious shadow court. It was the court. The entire tone of the British monarchy changed overnight. The dark, crepe-draped mourning of the Victorian age was swept away, replaced by the glittering, champagne-fueled glamour of the Edwardian era. The new king loved parties, he loved food, he loved racing, he loved women, and he loved life. The court became a nonstop parade of opulent state dinners, grand balls, and weekends at country houses. And for Louise and Arthur, this was a fresh kind of exile. They were, in essence, the other court. They were the sober, dutiful, military-focused couple, a living reminder of the Victorian seriousness the new king was so eager to escape. King Edward VII, however, was no fool. For all his love of pleasure, he was a shrewd and gifted diplomat, and he saw in his brother and sister-in-law a powerful, if unexciting, asset. He, the king, would be the face of the new glamorous Britain, but Arthur and Louise, the Duke and Duchess of Connaught, would be the face of its imperial dignity. They were his senior, most representatives, and he would use them. He dispatched them on grand tours, sending them to represent him at the most important functions of state, both at home and abroad. In 1903, they undertook a massive, grueling tour of India to attend the great Delhi Durbar. Louise, now in her 40s, had to step up. She could no longer be the shy princess, hiding behind Queen Victoria. She was now one of the most senior women in the empire, second only to the new Queen Alexandra and the Princess of Wales. And here, her Prussian upbringing, the very thing that had made her so awkward in London society, became her greatest weapon. She had Pflicht. She had duty. She might not have been fun, but she was flawless. Her sense of protocol was impeccable. Her dignity was unassailable. Her tireless work ethic was astonishing. She opened hospitals, reviewed troops, and sat through endless formal dinners with a regal composure that the new, more relaxed Edwardians found almost intimidating. She was, in this, the perfect professional princess. She couldn't compete with Queen Alexandra's dazzling charm, so she didn't. Instead, she built her reputation on a foundation of ironclad reliability. And in this new era, she had her own triumphs. Her children, her life's work, were now her greatest assets. In 1905, her eldest daughter, Daisy, made the most brilliant match of the decade. She married Prince Gustav Adolf, the heir to the throne of Sweden. Louise's daughter was now a crown princess, the future queen of a major European kingdom. The wedding, held in St. George's Chapel where Louise herself had been married, was her ultimate vindication. She, the awkward German princess, the daughter of the Red Prince, had raised a future queen. The photographs from that day show her, for one of the first times, looking not just composed, but profoundly, unmistakably proud. Her bloodline was now secured in yet another of Europe's great thrones. Her son Arthur was a success in his own right, a capable army officer following in his father's footsteps, and her youngest, Patsy, was a phenomenon. As she entered her 20s, Princess Patricia became the it girl of the Edwardian era, the most photographed, most talked about, and most beloved young royal in the world. She was beautiful, she was artistic, and she was refreshingly, scandalously normal. She was the star of the family, and her popularity reflected by extension on her mother. Louise had done what her own mother never could. She had raised 3 happy, successful, and well-adjusted children. But beneath this surface of Edwardian grandeur, the cracks in her world were widening. The Anglo-German naval race was escalating into a full-blown crisis. The dreadnought crisis, the feverish shipbuilding, the jingoistic, anti-German headlines in the British press. All of this was a personal torment. When she visited her family in Berlin, she was the English woman. When she was in London, she was increasingly the German. The tightrope was getting thinner. The political bridge was groaning under a weight it was never designed to bear. In 1910, King Edward VII died, and Louise's nephew-in-law, George V, ascended the throne. And one of the new king's first and most important appointments was to give his uncle, Prince Arthur, the most significant posting of his long career. He was to be the new Governor-General of Canada. This was no retirement package. This was a critical role in the most important, most powerful, and most loyal dominion of the British Empire. And for Louise Margaret, this was the pinnacle. She was to be the vice-regal consort. She would be Her Excellency. In 1911, the Connaughts, Arthur, Louise, and the dazzling Princess Patricia, set sail for Canada. And it was here, thousands of miles from the suspicious whispers of the British court and the saber-rattling of the German one, that Louise Margaret finally truly came into her own. The city of Ottawa and the official residence of Rideau Hall became her court. She was not second fiddle to Queen Alexandra. She was not the awkward sister-in-law. She was the first lady of the nation, and Canada fell in love with her. All the qualities that had made her seem heavy in London, her seriousness, her formal dignity, her deep love of the arts, made her the perfect regal representative of the king. She was not a frivolous socialite. She was a woman of substance. She and Arthur transformed Rideau Hall into the nation's cultural center, hosting grand balls, state dinners, and musical concerts. And Louise, the artist, found a profound connection with the wild, vast Canadian landscape. She was a gifted watercolorist, and she spent her happiest hours painting the lakes, forests, and rivers of her new home. She embraced the culture, famously building a toboggan run on the grounds of Rideau Hall, and becoming a passionate and very public fan of the new rough-and-tumble sport of ice hockey. This was her golden age. She was 52 years old, healthy, and for the first time in her life, universally beloved. She was Her Excellency, the Duchess of Connaught, a successful and respected stateswoman. Her daughter, Princess Patsy, was the darling of the entire Dominion, so popular that a new regiment, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, was named in her honor. Louise's life was, for this one brief, shining moment, perfect. She had overcome her traumatic childhood. She had survived the perils of the British court, and she had raised a perfect family. She had, in every sense of the word, won. She stood at the absolute pinnacle of her life, safe, secure, and adored, in the summer of 1913. But across the ocean, in the capitals of her two homes, the final fatal countdown had already begun. The perfect world she had built was about to be consumed by the very fire she had spent her entire life trying to escape. She had reached the summit, a place of safety and adoration thousands of miles from the conflicts of her past. But history is often cruel in its timing. This pinnacle of her life, this moment of supreme triumph in Canada, was not a new beginning. It was, in reality, a final beautiful sunlit afternoon, a brief and golden moment of peace before the endless, consuming night of the Great War. Louise's work was her joy. Her natural seriousness was now seen as a virtue. She was a tireless patron And she was not just a figurehead. She took an active, intelligent interest in the hospitals she supported, in the burgeoning Canadian art scene she championed, and in the military units that formed the backbone of the Dominion's pride. She was, as she had been raised to be, a model of flict, of duty. But here, in this new energetic country, her duty was met with genuine warmth and affection, not the suspicious chill of the European courts. Her painting, her art, became more than a hobby. It was her connection to the land itself. Her watercolors of the Gatineau Hills, of the St. Lawrence River, of the vast, snow-covered landscapes were not just technically proficient. They were full of a love and a peace that had eluded her for her entire life. This was her sanctuary. This was the life she had built. And at the center of it was her family. Her daughter, Princess Patsy, was the darling of the nation. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the regiment named in her honor, was a symbol of her family's complete and total integration into the fabric of Canadian life. It was their regiment. It represented their loyalty. Her son Arthur was a respected officer back in England. Her daughter Daisy was the Crown Princess of Sweden, a future queen, and a constant, loving correspondent. The bridge that Louise Margaret embodied was not just holding, it was a triumphant success. The union of German duty and British stability had, in her, created the perfect public servant. But as she sat painting in the quiet, sun-dappled grounds of Rideau Hall in the spring of 1914, the letters from her daughter Daisy in neutral Sweden were growing more anxious. The letters from her family in Berlin were more strained, full of a nationalistic bravado that chilled her. She was insulated by the vast expanse of the Atlantic, but she was not ignorant. She, who had grown up in the shadow of the Red Prince and at the table of the Iron Chancellor, knew how to read the signs. She knew the sound of marching boots, even when they were thousands of miles away. The continent of her birth was a powder keg, and her cousin, the Kaiser, was the one playing with matches. The first explosion came on June 28, 1914. And Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in a distant Balkan city called Sarajevo. It was a tragedy, yes, a shock to the interconnected royal families of Europe. But it was, they all hoped, a regional crisis. But then came the July crisis, the ultimatums, the mobilizations, the telegrams flying between the Kaiser, the Tsar, and the King of England. 3 cousins, her relatives, pushing millions of men toward a precipice. And then, on August 4th, 1914, the world ended. Great Britain declared war on the German Empire, and by that single act, Canada, as a loyal dominion of that empire, was also at war. It is impossible even now to fully comprehend the psychological catastrophe of that moment for Louise Margaret. This was not a political event. It was not a distant clash of armies. It was an existential internal shattering. The bridge she had been built to be, the bridge that was her entire identity, had just been blown apart, and she was left stranded in the middle of the inferno. In an instant, her 2 halves were at war. Her adopted country, Great Britain, the nation of her beloved husband and her children, was now the mortal enemy of her homeland, Germany, the nation of her father, her cousins, and her entire childhood. Her husband, Prince Arthur, was a British field marshal. Her nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was the German supreme warlord. Her son, Prince Arthur of Connaught, was a British officer who would be sent to the front. Her Prussian cousins, the men she had grown up with at Potsdam, were the very generals he would be fighting against. And the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the regiment named for her own daughter, would be among the very first to embark for Europe, to go and kill her people. The conflict was irreconcilable. It was a war being fought inside her own mind. Every British or Canadian victory, every celebratory headline in the Ottawa newspapers would mean the deaths of German boys, the sons of the land she had come from. Every German victory, every whispered rumor of a successful U-boat attack would mean the deaths of the sons of her new, beloved country, the very soldiers she had just shaken hands with. There was no one she could talk to. She was, in an instant, the loneliest woman in the world. Who could she grieve with? To show sorrow for a German loss would be treason. To show uncomplicated joy for an Allied victory would be a betrayal of her own blood. She was, in every sense of the word, the enemy to everyone. And in this moment of impossible, crushing psychological pressure, her Prussian upbringing, her lifetime of Pflicht, took over. It was the only thing she had left. She could not collapse. She could not falter. She was the wife of the Governor General. She was Her Excellency. And she would do her duty. She became, if it was possible, more British than the British. She threw her entire frantic energy into the war effort. She would be the model of patriotic sacrifice. Her public mask was one of perfect, calm, and tireless resolve. She became the patron-in-chief of the Canadian Military Nursing Services. She established funds for military families. She toured the country raising money, inspecting facilities, and inspiring the troops. Her public life became a whirlwind of patriotic duty. She was at the docks, farewelling the troop ships of the 1st Canadian Division, her face a calm, regal mask as she wished them Godspeed. And a few months later, she was at the hospitals, in her nurse's uniform, sitting with the first wave of those same men as they returned, shattered and maimed, from the first poison gas attacks at Ypres. Imagine the strength, the iron self-control it took to sit holding the hand of a young Canadian soldier, his lungs burned out by chlorine gas, knowing that the order to release that gas had come from a command structure that included her own family. To comfort a mother whose son had been killed by a shell fired from a Krupp artillery gun, the pride of her homeland. Her hands were never, ever still. She knitted. This is the detail that biographers and eyewitnesses from the time all remember. Day and night she knitted. Socks, scarves, balaclavas, thousands of items. She sat through endless, tense state dinners, her needles clicking, clicking, clicking. It was more than a hobby. It was an anchor. It was the only way, friends and ladies-in-waiting would later say, that she could manage the unceasing, unbearable, and silent internal screaming. She was knitting, quite literally, to hold herself together. For the first year of the war, this mask held. Her tireless work was praised. The Canadian people saw a duchess who was sacrificing just as they were. But the war was not over by Christmas 1914. It was not a glorious adventure. It was a squalid industrial slaughter. And as the casualty lists grew longer, the mood in the empire turned dark. It turned fearful. And it turned to poison. A vicious, hysterical wave of anti-German paranoia swept across the world. This was not a war against a government. It was a war against a people. In Britain, King George V was facing riots. Anyone or anything with a German name was now the enemy within. Local townspeople smashed the windows of shops owned by families with German-sounding names. Dachshunds, the German dogs, were kicked in the streets. This paranoia reached the very top. The king's own First Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, a loyal British admiral, was hounded from office purely because of his German birth. The whispers grew so loud that the king himself, her nephew-in-law, was forced to consider the unthinkable, changing the family's very name. This same fever, this same witch hunt was raging in Canada. And in Ottawa, the paranoid gaze of the public began to search for a scapegoat. Who was the most high-profile, most powerful, and most German person in the entire Dominion? It was the Governor General's wife. The whispers started quietly in the drawing rooms of Ottawa society, in the halls of Parliament. The Duchess. She seemed sad. She seemed distant. When news of a great Allied victory was announced, she didn't look happy enough. Her natural reserve, her lifetime of shy Prussian formality, the very dignity that Canada had once admired was now reinterpreted. It was not dignity, it was coldness. It was not sorrow, it was suspicion. Her accent, once seen as charming and continental, now sounded guttural and Hunnish. The whispers grew louder and they grew darker. She was a secret German sympathizer. She was cold to the wounded soldiers. Why did she spend so much time alone? Why was she always so quiet? What was she hiding? The rumors, fed by the fear and grief of a nation at war, began to coalesce. They twisted her reality, turning her virtues into evidence of her vice. And finally, in 1915, those whispers burst into a specific, tangible, and utterly insane accusation. The rumor was this: the Duchess of Connaught, Her Excellency, was a spy. This wasn't just a vague insinuation. It was a fully formed conspiracy theory. It wasn't just a vague insinuation. It was a fully formed conspiracy theory. Ottawa gossip even claimed she kept a secret wireless set in her rooms to signal German U-boats with the sailing times of Allied convoys, a story for which no real evidence was ever produced. And the information she was sending? The sailing times, the routes, and the cargo manifests of the very convoy ships she was seen farewelling at the docks. This was the ultimate betrayal, the most profound psychological knife twist. Her most visible public displays of loyalty, her visits to the docks, her review of the ships, were now being used as the primary evidence of her treachery. She was, the rumor mill claimed, a Judas, giving a kiss of death to the very boys she was pretending to bless. This was not just idle back-fence gossip. The accusation became so pervasive, so widely circulated, that it could no longer be ignored. It reached the highest levels of the Canadian government and the military. It became a genuine political and personal crisis for her husband, the Duke of Connaught, the King's son, a British field marshal. The very embodiment of the empire's loyalty was now in the unthinkable, humiliating position of having to manage the political fallout, of having to reassure his own government that his wife was not, in fact, a high-level traitor committing mass murder. For Louise Margaret, this was the end. This was the breaking point. This was the reward for a lifetime of flicht. She had given 35 years of her life to Britain. She had renounced her home. She had sat by in silent agony as her old world was destroyed by her new one. She had for 2 years torn her own soul apart, sitting in hospitals and knitting for a war effort that was killing her own blood. And her reward was this: to be called a spy, to be called a traitor, to have her loyalty, the one thing that had cost her everything, thrown back in her face as a monstrous lie. The woman who had been the active, vibrant, and beloved vice-regal consort simply vanished. The Golden Age was now a living hell. She ceased all public appearances. She became a recluse in her own home, confined to her rooms, looked after by her doctors. The official word was that she was ill. She was exhausted. She was suffering from nerves. But she was, in fact, broken. She was a victim of a profound nervous collapse, a woman shattered by a psychological burden that no human being could be expected to bear. In 1916, the Duke of Connaught's term as Governor General came to an end. It was a relief. The family packed up their belongings at Rideau Hall. They left Canada, the country that had been the scene of their greatest triumph and their most profound personal trauma. They did not leave in triumph. They slipped away under a dark cloud of suspicion, failure, and personal devastation. They sailed back to England in the autumn of 1916, but the England they returned to was not the glittering Edwardian world they had left. It was a bitter, exhausted nation at war. She came back as a woman unmoored, no country that fully claimed her, and no role that could still protect her. This was the state in which Louise Margaret was forced to return to the country she had once called home. Her arrival back in England in the autumn of 1916 was not a journey to safety. It was the final devastating act of her tragedy, a confirmation that the woman who left 5 years earlier no longer existed. The glittering, confident Edwardian world was gone, replaced by a nation that was exhausted, bankrupt, and consumed by a cold, hardened fury. This was the Britain of the Somme, a country that had just sacrificed 60,000 men in a single day. The anti-German hysteria of 1914 had not faded. It had curdled into a deep, systemic, and institutionalized hatred. This was a nation that had seen Zeppelins, German Zeppelins, bombing London, killing civilians in their beds. The idea of a German in their midst, let alone at the very heart of the royal family, was no longer just a suspicion. It was an intolerable insult. For Louise Margaret, the return to London was not a homecoming. It was a final internal exile. They moved back into their London residence, Clarence House, but the Duchess was, in truth, a ghost. The woman who returned from Canada was not the vibrant, dutiful Her Excellency who had been so beloved. She was a frail, heartbroken invalid, a woman hollowed out by grief and shame. She was, in the clinical sense, suffering from a profound, acute depression. But in a more human sense, she was a woman who had simply finally been broken by the impossible, tearing weight of her own identity. The whispers had not stayed in Canada. They had followed her across the Atlantic. In London society, she was the German Duchess, the Kaiser's aunt, a figure of profound suspicion and pity. She rarely left her home. Her world, which had once spanned empires, now shrank to the confines of a few rooms. Her husband, Prince Arthur, now in his late 60s, was also a man somewhat adrift. His great service was over, and he was now tasked with the grim full-time job of caring for his shattered wife. He was, as always, her devoted protector. But what could he protect her from? He could not protect her from the headlines in the Daily Mail, screaming for the internment of all Germans. He could not protect her from the casualty lists posted in the streets, a daily reminder of the slaughter being committed in her family's name. He could not protect her from her own mind, her own memories, or the unbearable silent conflict that was still raging within her. Her health, which had been delicate her entire life, now completely collapsed. The nervous exhaustion diagnosed in Canada was the beginning of a rapid, fatal decline. Her body, worn down by years of relentless psychological stress, had no reserves, no fight left. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was one of the bitterest on record in Britain. The country was suffering not just from the war, but from food shortages, coal shortages, and a rampant, deadly wave of influenza that swept through the weakened, malnourished population. Louise, in her frail, depressed state, was a perfect target. She caught the flu. It quickly, predictably turned into severe bronchitis. Her lungs, perhaps, could no longer bear the weight of all the unbreathable, unspeakable sorrow. She was dying, and she was dying at the very moment that her two worlds were preparing for their final, absolute divorce. As Louise lay in her bed at Clarence House, Fading through the first months of 1917, a parallel drama was unfolding just down the street at Buckingham Palace. Her nephew-in-law, King George V, was facing the greatest crisis of his reign. The war was going badly. Russia, his ally, was collapsing into revolution, and his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, was being overthrown. At home, the anti-German feeling had reached a fever pitch. The public was openly questioning the loyalty of a royal family that was, in fact, almost entirely German. Their name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Their relatives were the kings and dukes of enemy states. The rising tide of republicanism, which had just drowned the Tsar, was now lapping at the very foundations of the British throne. The king, a practical, unsentimental man, knew he had to act. He had to perform a public exorcism. He had to sever, publicly and brutally, every last tie to the German heritage that Louise Margaret, his aunt, embodied. And so, on March 14th, 1917, as the Duchess of Connaught was taking her final labored breaths, the British government was preparing the legal framework for what would happen 3 months later. On that day at Clarence House, with her devoted husband Arthur and her beloved children at her side, Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia, Duchess of Connaught, died. She was only 56 years old. Her death in that moment was more than a personal tragedy. It was a profound, almost anachronistic piece of political symbolism. Her death was, in effect, the funeral for the entire 19th century idea of dynastic Anglo-German alliance. She was its first great symbol, and she was its last tragic victim. She, the living bridge, died at the very moment the bridge was being officially and permanently demolished. Her funeral was held a few days later. It was a military funeral, as befitted the wife of a field marshal and a member of the royal family. She was, as the papers noted, widely mourned, but the mourning was quiet, almost subdued. This was not a time for grand displays of grief for a Prussian princess. Her husband, the stoic soldier, was devastated. He had lost the sweet, amiable woman he had chosen 38 years earlier. Her children were heartbroken. But for the nation, her death was almost a relief, a quiet closing of a very awkward, very German chapter. And then came the final brutal epilogue. Just 4 months after her death, in July 1917, King George V, having navigated the political minefield, issued his famous historic proclamation. He, on behalf of his entire family, renounced and relinquished every single German title, dignity, and honor they held. He stripped his German cousins, his own relatives, Louise's relatives, of their British peerages and their status as British princes. And most famously, most symbolically, he changed the family's name. The German name of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was cast aside. From that day forward, the British royal family would be known by a new, defiantly English and thoroughly manufactured name, the House of Windsor. It was a masterstroke of public relations, a total rebranding, an act of national survival. But it was also the ultimate, final repudiation of everything Louise Margaret had been. She had died a Princess of Prussia, a Duchess of Connaught, a member of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. She died just in time to be spared the humiliation of seeing the very identity she had been born with, the identity that had cost her so much, declared by her own family to be toxic, alien, and worthless. In a final curious break from the suffocating traditions that had defined her entire life, Louise Margaret made one last modern request. She had asked to be cremated. This was highly, highly unusual for the time, almost unheard of for a senior member of the British royal family. The practice was still viewed with deep suspicion, as something almost pagan, certainly not royal. But her wish was granted. She was the first member of the British royal family to be cremated. a quiet, personal, and perhaps defiant choice from a woman who had in life never been allowed a choice at all. Her ashes were placed temporarily in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, where she had been married. They were later moved to a new, more private royal burial ground at Frogmore, in a quiet garden far from the pomp in the palaces. Her husband, Prince Arthur, would outlive her by a quarter of a century. He would live to be 91, a lonely, dutiful, and deeply sad old man. He would live to see the world that had destroyed his wife do it all over again, to see his two countries, his beloved Britain and the Germany of his late wife, locked in a second, even more catastrophic world war. He died in 1942, a living relic of a world and an alliance that was gone forever. The immediate impact of Louise Margaret's life and death was one of silence. She was, for a long time, a forgotten figure, an embarrassing footnote, the German Duchess who had the bad manners to die in the middle of a war with Germany. Her story was not one the new, aggressively English House of Windsor was eager to tell. She was a reminder of the past they had so successfully buried. But her legacy was not in politics. It was not in stone monuments. Her legacy was in her blood, and it would prove to be far more enduring than the empires that had crushed her. Her children, the ones she had poured all her love and her artistic soul into, would carry her story forward. Her son Arthur served with distinction in the war, but his own son, her grandson, would die tragically young, meaning the Connaught ducal line would eventually die out. It was through her daughters that her true legacy would flow. Her eldest, Princess Margaret, Daisy, the Crown Princess of Sweden, would tragically follow her mother to an early grave. She died in 1920, just 3 years after her mother, from an infection at the age of 38. But she had already given birth to 5 children, including a daughter named Ingrid. And that daughter, Ingrid, Louise's granddaughter, would marry the heir to the throne of Denmark. Queen Ingrid of Denmark would become one of the 20th century's most beloved and formidable matriarchs. And her daughters, in turn, would sit on the thrones of Denmark and Greece. This means that today the current king of Sweden, Karl XVI Gustav, is the great-grandson of Louise Margaret, and the current king of Denmark, Frederick X, is her great-great-grandson. The blood of the Red Prince of Prussia and the shy Duchess now flows through the two most stable, most modern, and most successful monarchies in Scandinavia. And then there was Patsy, her youngest, most beloved daughter. Princess Patricia, the darling of Canada, would do what Louise herself never could. She would choose love over duty. In 1919, just after the war, in a move that stunned the world, Princess Patricia announced she would be marrying a commoner, a naval commander, and war hero named Alexander Ramsay. And in doing so, she voluntarily and famously relinquished her title of Her Royal Highness and her status as a princess. She chose to be known simply as Lady Patricia Ramsay. It was a revolutionary act, a move toward modernity that her mother, trapped by her title, could only have dreamed of. Patsy, the artist, lived a long, happy, and immensely popular life, free from the suffocating burden of the rank that had destroyed her mother. The story of Princess Louise Margaret is not a grand political epic. It is not a tale of scandals or of passionate, history-changing decisions. It is a tragedy of a different and perhaps more profound kind. It is a quiet, personal, and deeply human story of collateral damage. She was a woman who was born, raised, and married for one single symbolic purpose: to be a bridge. Her entire life was a political calculation, a testament to the 19th century idea that two great nations, linked by blood, faith, and family, could be a single, indomitable force for peace. And her life is a testament to the terrible, bloody, and spectacular failure of that idea. She was not a spy. She was not a traitor. She was a woman of profound, if quiet, feeling, a woman of deep artistic sensibility who was trapped from birth in a role that demanded she be made of iron. She was a gentle soul forged in the heart of Prussian militarism, only to be offered as a living sacrifice to an alliance that was, in the end, nothing but a fantasy. When the war came, the war she had been married to prevent, she was not allowed to be human. She was not allowed to grieve for both sides. She was not allowed to be torn. She was forced to choose. And when a terrified, grieving public decided with no evidence that she had chosen wrong, they hounded her to her grave. She was the princess torn between two thrones, and in the end, there was no place for her on either. Her homeland, Prussia, was dissolved, its very name erased from the map. Her adopted home, Britain, erased her heritage from its own name. She was, in the end, a woman from nowhere. Her public life as a dynastic bridge, which began in 1879, became, in 1917, the ultimate symbol of the brutal personal cost of war. And when those empires decided to go to war, she was the first and most tragic casualty.